Good morning, everyone. How are your heads? Put up your hand. Who had a big night? Oh, aren't you dull? Half a hand went up here. Let's try it again. Who had a semi-big night? Aren't you sensible?
Everyone's watching you.
I'm so disappointed. Remember, what happens on the Gold Coast stays on the Gold Coast. That's right. Welcome to Screen Wars. I don't think anyone thought this topic was going to be so topical when they put it together. But congratulations to the team for having the third eye and seeing into the future. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand today, a place of storytelling for tens of thousands of years. I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So, in a highly globalised industry, what happens when one nation decides to make unilateral declarations of authority to preserve their economic dominance? That's just a fancy way of saying Donald Trump. But is Donald Trump that name, the disruptor that he is it a distraction? And is it actually misleading when it comes to the reality? You've got a fabulous panel today that's going to get right down to the nitty-gritty in 45 minutes. I'd love you to chuck in your questions. So use Pigeonhole. I think you can scan a QR code on the back of your program which leads you to the app. Please put those questions in there and we're going to get to it as soon as possible. Because screen content creation, as everyone in this room knows, has become a creative industry that crosses borders virtually, digitally and bodily. So how can you even try and slam those doors shut? So we'll see how that goes for Donald. And in the meantime, places like the EU, Ireland, Canada and Australia, and that's what this panel is about today, now have to manage that reality. So let me introduce to you your wonderful panel. Valerie Creighton, on the end here, is an industry leader in Canada's arts, culture and media sectors. This is the Canadian contingent today with one ring in the middle.
I'm the one who swears.
Sorry?
I'm the one who swears.
The one who swears. Oh, wonderful. Great. Welcome. We talk the same language. Valerie is currently the President and CEO of the Canada Media Fund. And in this role, Valerie positions Canadian programming at the forefront in world markets, promoting successful, innovative Canadian content and software applications for current and emerging digital platforms. Please welcome Valerie. Oh my God, really?
Yeah, come on, woo!
I'm going to ask you to do a little better than that. Okay, Karen Thorne-Stone. Karen, say hello. Has been President and CEO of Ontario Creates since July 2007, overseeing all aspects of the agency's programs and services, which serves as a catalyst for economic development in Ontario's creative industries. Please welcome Karen Thorne-Stone. There you go. This is our little wake-up session. And Lisa Broadfoot, next to me here, is the Canadian Media Producers Association Vice President. So you kind of like, you guys are sort of the same here. You're this one. I'm jumping over this guy in the middle because you know him. Vice President, Industry and Business Affairs. In this position, Lisa plays a strategic role leading business affairs support for CMPA members across a range of areas, including project development, financing, production planning, sales and business growth. Please welcome Lisa. And this guy in the middle of Matthew Dina, Screen Producers Association of Australia, he can have a clap. Go on, give him one. So send those questions in. Let's get right down to it first of all. Who's afraid of not Virginia Woolf but Donald Trump? Are you genuinely worried by this announcement, Valerie?
No, I think this is a bit of a distraction. I mean, it's so difficult so he makes these things all the time. He's a master, I think, of creating unsettled chaos, and sometimes, you know, you can't really read, does he really have an agenda? Does he really know something that he's projecting these ideas on? But even the US, you know, the reaction in the US was, what? We thought we were getting a tax credit for California. So no, I don't think it's about fear. I think it's a distraction, and I think there's bigger issues that all of us, and particularly, we're talking Australia and Canada, need to focus on as two countries to work together. So I'm not afraid. Is it tiresome? Does it take a lot of energy? Because, you know, yes, everybody reacts and you have to respond to ministers and the industry, but fear isn't. It's just not for our mix anyway.
I think it's a moment
Hold
of
that nice and close there, pretty directional, up high. I think, yeah.
I think it's a moment of awakening for us to pay attention to other partnerships around the world, and that we're not so. There you go. Hey, Jackie. Good morning.
Round of applause
Jackie
for other
Feeney.
partnerships.
I think in Canada we've become complacent, if not dependent, on that relationship with the U.S. And I totally agree with Val. I don't think we're worried about it. I think we have seen a lot of bluster from this president in many sectors, and in time that has softened in each case, and the practical reality of how he could possibly implement what he's proposing, it seems unlikely, but it is certainly a moment for us to sit up, pay attention, and think about building stronger relationships and co-production elsewhere around the world.
Lisa?
I agree, and I think we have to separate the signal from the noise here. And for us at the CMP, part of the signal is this is a teachable moment for why we have to focus on a strong domestic industry and not rely so heavily on the United States for our production sectors. So that's what our focus is on.
Matt, in the 48 hours since you've heard it, is it sort of, have you levelled out?
It's been a full-on 24 hours, hasn't it? Or at least probably for all of us. I agree with everything we're talking about here. And I think the difficulty in our industry, and we talk about the global relationship with the US, I think it's a 3 or 4% trade, risk. So Australia's relationship with the US is important, of course, for strategic and many reasons, but it's not a big trading exercise. In our industry, however, it is a bigger exercise. And that's been something that our governments collectively have been looking to try to strategize around for decades. Part of the reason we've all got content obligations, part of the reasons there's been incentives, part of the reasons there's infrastructure has been an ongoing challenge of navigating essentially very large global dominating businesses that have built infrastructure pieces to, in a very strategic business sense, you've got to hats off to sort of, push out essentially their product through integrated globalization of their work. And in any other industry, there's various measures to protect it. If it was a good, you wouldn't have price dumping in the way that essentially happens in this sort of industry. But because of it being a service part, which is also the reason you can't put a tariff on it, you have had governments resisting that. And this is just almost a big moment in a succession of big moments that are about ensuring we have a national voice and story.
I want to get to the details of how the current trade wars are affecting the screen industry in Canada and Australia and the steps that you're taking. You're right in the middle of, really interesting sort of pushbacks and negotiations right now. But just for the room, and I'm sure it's clear to us whenever we watch the credits of any American movie, the production border between Canada and America is very, very porous, isn't it, Lisa?
Very porous. It's in some ways, it's like the auto sector. It's a very integrated production chain. So a number of U.S. productions come up and shoot in Canada. They post in the States. It's very, very integrated. And in some ways, it's been great for the Canadian sector in that it creates a lot of jobs. It creates a lot of infrastructure. It trains up our crews. When last year with the effects of the strikes, foreign location service in Canada actually dropped quite significantly. It was down 26%. And again, a real teachable moment. It showed us just how vulnerable you can be to outside forces when something happens outside your borders, and it can really affect the entire industry. But the truth is that we are incredibly integrated. The truth also is that the U.S. has a very strong trade surplus with the content that it exports, and the prospect of potential retaliatory tariffs, it would just be an enormous mess to try and untangle the global production industry we've become.
Karen and Valerie, did you hear from producers or others in the United States after this announcement by Donald Trump as nonplussed as you were? I mean, because of the porous nature of work across the border.
Not producers, for sure. I mean, the Canadian industry rallied together the day the tweet was made and tried to decide what the next steps in action are, and kind of are on hold because so much of it's unknown. I think, we've all been watching the news and the various tweets about how the U.S. production community has reacted. And it's I think our focus will be it's damage to them. Never mind what will happen in Canada. It's a big damage to that sector that does tremendous amount of service production in Canada. We don't want that to go away for sure. So,
and they don't want it to go away. I mean, I think that those are the questions we were getting: is what information do you have? What reassurance can you give us that we can continue to do business as we've been doing it? And I think the various trade associations have been very good at reassuring their membership that it is much ado about nothing, at least at this point in time.
Okay. Valerie, can you update us about where things are at in Canada with the regulation of streaming platforms?
It's not that boring as it sounds. We've actually been at this conversation for 5 years. It was 2020 where the first bill, C-10, that was to amend the Broadcasting Act, was tabled in the House. There was a lot of fury around it.
What were you after?
Well, they were after changes to the Broadcasting Act itself. It became the Online Streaming Act a couple of years later, but the public policy was to really bring the streamers into the system in Canada in some way, shape, or form. They're in the country. Who doesn't like them in the country? It's fantastic. Who doesn't watch Netflix or Disney? But the point for Canada was, what's the contribution? And they're very good at positioning themselves in terms of how much money they're spending there. At the CRTC hearing, they talked about expenditures of $500 million, which is all true, primarily service production. And there was no differentiation between what that means in terms of intellectual property rights and taking the rights outside of the country and all of that. So in 2020, the first bill came in. It was very controversial. It became a political football because the fear was, or what it was positioned as, a censorship bill and trying to regulate user-generated content. That bill died when the federal election was called in 2021, and then the Online Streaming Act came in 2023. So similar objectives, bringing the streamers in, the how and the where and the what. You know, they're in the country, they use a lot of broadband. They never speak publicly about how much they do take out of Canada, out of the federal tax credit system and the provincial tax credit systems for service production. And it's a huge amount of money. I don't know the number. Lisa or Karen might, but I don't off the top of my head. So this bill did pass in the Parliament. Then the government gave the policy marching orders to the CRTC, and as you know, that's underway. There's kind of 3 stages. Last fall was the first hearing, and it was to determine what was called base contributions. And I think part of the frustration of all of us is it's in parts, and so nobody really knows what the end result is going to be. And the streamers particularly reacted to that negatively because they didn't want to contribute to a few things until they knew what the whole requirement might be. So it came out, and it was a 5% contribution, which was kind of trying to level the playing field between the broadcast, what was the broadcast sector, and the streaming sector, as our broadcasters have content regulations, but their parent companies also are regulated to provide 5% of their income, and those are the big telecoms. So for us, it was quite a lot of money. Right. So they did the 5%. I'll just give you a couple of strange examples. First of all, the streamers don't have to report to the CRTC till August of this year. So nobody really knows what the outcome's going to be, depending on how they behave. For the Canada Media Fund, we were one of the largest percentages at 2% of the whole series. But the weird thing was, of the 2%, they allowed the streamers, 1.5% of that 2%, to decide if they wanted to do original content or acquisitions. So the minute that announcement was made at the Banff Television Festival last year, of course they started to acquire. I mean, wouldn't you? That's the business model. So the irony is they're acquiring content, potentially, from the Canadian system that was paid for by Canada, made by Canada to meet their new content regulations. Right. The upcoming hearing is starting in, are we in May? Is this May? Yes, it's May. So it's starting, I think, in this week or next week, going through till about the end of May. Now, it's going to be extremely interesting because the 2 primary discussions are on the definition of Canadian content and what will the expenditure requirements for these streamers be. Our hope is, once that's all said and done, they'll get rid of this base contribution amount because they were very distressed about the news piece, and that's why they're in court. That court date is set for June. Everybody's hopeful there'll be a decision made before they have to respond in August.
Thanks for that. Did you want to jump in there, Karen? Or, well, Matt, listening to this, and Minister Burke's been upfront about how hard it has been to deal with the US, streamers in getting the agreement that we want there as well. Are there any lessons here or any parallels?
Yeah, I think I wanted to add also that the US exceptionalism is also driving how brilliant our industry is at times, and indeed the streamers' exceptionalism has awakened and enlivened people to global content. So these are all positives. There's many good things about what we're talking about. And then it's about how do we moderate this in a way that suits our community. Where we're at the moment, we go back to the first convergence review in 2012, 2011, where recommendations started rolling out, 7 or 8 reviews, a real delay around this.
Not too much history here, just because.
Yeah, but where we're at the moment is, I think, an opportunity for a reset, because where the conversation started to take us further and further down towards was snookered in effect by streamers arguing different things that we disagree with around the US free trade agreement. And that included a model. Valerie's talking about 5% of revenue in Canada. The streamers have been arguing a model around their expenditure in this market. And the complication of that is the unknown numbers that is, and the difficulty of having, I think, a guaranteed layer of ongoing investment that grows with their growth as a revenue base. So I think what we're talking about then is all of this chaos, and indeed a supercharged, successful Labor government going in, is an opportunity for a bit of a reset in the conversation. But we don't want to delay this. We also want to get something pinned down, because time is kicking and wasting,
Yeah. Lisa, with the new Canadian government that you've had elected, like here in Australia, your country's taken a much more aggressive position against US tariffs. So how is that playing out?
Well, we do have a trade agreement in place that, when Trump negotiated in the first term, it was the best deal ever, and now suddenly it's the worst trade agreement in history. So that doesn't actually expire until 2026. But yes, with the tariffs, which are clearly a violation of CUSMA, with a flimsy pretext of national security, the tariffs are clearly a violation of that agreement. So obviously the whole agreement is in question now. So yes, it will be renegotiated. How long that takes, we're not clear. But the CRTC will continue to implement Bill C-11. And to be fair, the streamers are engaging. They are part of this process. They just disagree about the extent to which they should have to contribute to the system.
And what happens to content creation and to the not the viability, but the vibrancy of the sector when you get locked down into another renegotiation of a free trade agreement? That makes my heart sink when you say that, I've got to say, Lisa, because really, I mean, what does it do for the sector, Karen?
I think that a thriving screen sector in Canada, in Ontario, relies on a strong ecosystem. That is both domestic production and its service production, its post, it's live, it's animated, and so on. At the heart of it, it's really about the talent that we've got in Canada, and the locations and the services and the suppliers and so on, and being able to provide a no surprises environment. And that's, I think, what's at risk when we have this kind of uncertainty. We can be confident in the tools and incentives that Canada is providing, but what the US counterbalance to that is going to be will be uncertain at best. And I think that's what upsets things in this process.
And I think that's really worth carrying forward, because what we're dealing with creative industries, which are by nature not as stable as others, and it's gig-based, structured in a way that you require many component parts to come together. This uncertainty is killing us, right? And it creates the biggest problem of uncertainty, is sort of stops everyone in their tracks, pulls back money, everyone's not sure whether to go forward, and also we're not sure that they want to work in a sector as unstable as this. Why would you do that if you've got to pay your bills and do all these things? So the job of us all is to try to create more certainty than currently exists. It's what we were hearing last night yesterday from Screen Australia. That is a certainty piece we're hearing. Government is a certainty exercise. That's what we've all got to try to deliver.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And, we've done similar things. The Canadian government is in the process of modernizing the sector to respond to some of these things. The Screen Australia announcement was fantastic. There's so many parallels. But, production does keep going. And in Canada, we've had lots of models where you've got the streamers in for big money. The Canadian broadcast system is in. Our money is in. An example I've used just recently, there's a production by 2 Inuit women out of Iqaluit, our northern territory, called North of North. They own it. They retained the rights. Netflix has the biggest amount of money in it. These women have been in the industry for 25 years. They've just never had an opportunity, it's a series, at this level. And it's in the top 10 of Netflix's distribution in 27 countries in the world. So there are some highlight, I suppose, or success stories that jump in, because people will find ways to keep creating, and if there's barriers, our industries worldwide, domestically, are very smart in trying to overcome them with maybe less reliance on the U.S. relationship in
I
future.
think there are parallel tracks here too, right? There's the regulatory uncertainty and there's a pullback in commissioning, but at the same time, the streamers are still engaging and Canadian broadcasters are still engaging. Production is moving forward, so it's it's their obligation to resist regulation. That's just what they do. But at the same time, deals are still happening.
Well, one of the things that makes us such a competitive jurisdiction in terms of attracting U.S. production is the cost ratio. So it's the incentives along with the low Canadian dollar that helps to attract production to Ontario.
And your wonderful locations.
And that too, of course, and the amazing talent. It is a full toolkit.
Come, spend money. Our dollar's at 12 cents.
Not as good
one
as
of the things-
Queensland, not as good as Queensland. Just obligation to Jackie, not as good as Queensland.
But one of the
Nice
things
to have visitors here.
we're watching now is what will happen to the U.S. dollar. With all of the nonsense going on in the U.S. at the moment, if that starts to crash markets and there is less of a differentiation between the Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar, there may be things that are out of our control that will make us less competitive. And that sort of brings us right back to where we started, which is we have to be paying attention to our domestic, local content and to our international partnerships outside of the U.S.
Did you want to jump in there, Valerie?
No, I was just going to say it's happened for years, months when the dollars fluctuate. Canada and the U.S. were on par at one point in time, so that affects how much production comes up. Now it's very low, so generally it's more attractive.
And different parts of Canada will be affected in different ways. Ontario typically is give or take 50-50, local and service, whereas on the West Coast, where they've got that convenient time zone with LA, they have a much higher amount of service proportionately.
What I was going to say is that the brilliance of this, in some ways, is how it raises the conversation into all these pockets where we are often talking to ourselves a bit. We're now talking to the Australian public. We're talking, you guys, we were talking, I think Pete was saying, the cab driver, was it? Talking about, this is a big thing. Kate Carnell doing, I think, 20 interviews on television in the last 24 hours around this, me doing another, I don't have many on radio. It's raising the complications of the sector to a broader audience and indeed putting, I think, a degree of noticeability and pressure on things to kind of move forward from our government, but probably
This
also from
totally
yours.
happened in Canada. He gave us such a kick in the ass. We woke up as a country, and suddenly the patriotism and the realization that we are a sovereign nation with our own cultural identity has never been so high in Canada. Grocery stores are ticketing little red Maple Leafs. I lost mine. I don't know where it went.
Who
sold it.
stole
You have
it?
Another. And just showing Canadian.
It's autumn here.
These are Canadian. The booze is gone. American booze has gone off the shelves. People who had properties in California or Florida for years have sold them. Tourism is depressed. Like, people are not going down to the U.S. A woman I know buys her groceries across the border and was held up for 5 hours at the Canadian border and taxed heavily because she was shopping in the U.S. primarily. I mean, Canadians have raised the flag. Elbows up is the hockey analogy that our comedians are using to get the U.S. out of the way. Like, come on, guys. And, it's fantastic. It just still gives me chills when you see a whole country come together, including Quebec, who has constantly talked about separating. I mean, they are part of our country.
That is a big deal.
But now
This
we
is
got
very
Alberta on
Canadian,
the
I love
rant.
it.
Now we got Alberta on the rant. A referendum to separate? Give me a break. Anyway.
There you go.
I think that's sort of like our WA equivalent, like the secessionist country all the way over there. So
Where's
that'll
Ricky Lee?
Explain that. I've got a question here from. Hang on, where's it gone? Robert McKnight, I think, from TV Black Box. Is that right? Am I correct there? Is the panel in favour of content quotas for streamers? The Australian commercial networks are opposed to them. They say it'll increase the cost of production if Netflix, Disney, etc. are using the same limited resources. Lisa?
Well, we don't really call them quotas in Canada, but Canadian...
You call them?
We call them contribution requirements and Canadian production expenditure
Does
requirements.
that help?
Well, the Canadian broadcasters currently have them, and it depends on the broadcaster. They vary in rates. But yes, that is part of what's happening with the Online Streaming Act, and the implementation of it is how we bring the streamers into that regulatory tent. As Valerie said, that base contribution requirement was always intended to be a stopgap, and that was a requirement to contribute to funds. And then the next phase, as they roll through, will be what do they propose and what will the CRTC agree is their contribution to Canadian programming? What is
Well,
their CPE contribution going to look like?
The other thing is the Canadian broadcast system are fighting like hell to get rid of the regulatory requirements. So we don't know where this is going to end up. Worst case, streamers get everything they want, including the definition of what Canadian content is. The broadcasters get relief of everything they've been required to do, and then we are a banana republic for the US. So that's the worst case scenario. I don't think that'll happen. I mean, I think we'll see where the balance lands, but it's true what Lisa says. Quotas is just you immediately in your mind go to, I don't know what the analogy is, but quota is such a negative term in a way.
Oh, you sound like the Liberal Party now, honestly.
And for us, the real
Well,
key...
they're embracing it now. Who knows? Can I just say that the commercial television's been running a bit of a furphy argument about this, let's be frank. The problem is they're hopelessly conflicted because they have streaming services as part of their business models. And, the idea that they don't have really any significant obligations for drama, none for children's in practice. There's no actually overlapping area of concern. So the idea that you're running a cost argument is just a bit of a game that's being played. It's not that. It's about global production at different times. And indeed, their contributions, as we know, have just become virtually, insignificant in relation to the rest of the frame. So that's a spoiling tactic, I think, in terms of their and protecting their business model of Stan and Paramount Plus, in those instances for the commercial television sector. And I think people stare that down and go, nah.
Sorry, Karen.
I was just going to say, I think it is worth saying that Canada is unique in the size of the border, that we've got that large undefended border with the US, which is sort of where you started, in the sense that the content, it's very porous, and content goes back and forth. Language is in common, culture is in common, business models. Like, there is really nothing other than quotas to, again, don't like the word, I suppose, but we need to do something to help elevate our domestic producers and help them compete in that market.
Well, I wanted to ask you specifically, Karen, about production and about, what your office and others do to boost local production. But I just quickly want to pick up something that you said, Valerie. You said the local broadcasters are fighting tooth and nail to get rid of any requirements. Do they not have a desire or feel an obligation to make local content?
Well, the public broadcasters do, like the CBC, equivalent to your ABC, and the educational networks. But the commercial broadcasters, not so much. I mean, they considered it a forced tax right from the get-go. They didn't want to pay. They want to go to Hollywood and get, much cheaper content that's already made at the upfronts. And then they make a ton of money on it because of simultaneous substitution. So no, I wouldn't say their driving motive is we've got to do this because it's great. Now, when they get behind a show, and they often do, especially lately, our Indigenous content makers, it does incredibly well for them. So they do once in a while have these big tent poles that come up and they really get behind it. Generally, if you look at the schedules, most of the commercial broadcasters in this last 5 months have been announcing we don't fund reality, like CMF is Drama Doc Kids, Variety and Performing Arts, and our kids' content is in a disastrous state, and we've just done a bunch of new initiatives on that. But they're announcing reality shows, Vote Off the Island, who'd you have sex with last week, or whatever they are. I mean, I'm not being dismissive. I know people love that stuff. Who'd you have sex with last week?
I'm seeing David Knox that's going to quote in TV tonight, I tell you.
But the point being, that's their business model. You can't really fault them for that in a way. And there's, a big debate about how much government money the public broadcaster gets and they don't.
Matt?
We've got to keep thinking about the fact that these guys are very big businesses and they've got boards they're reporting to. So their game is to minimise risk and increase profit. And the best way to do that is not take risks on original formats, new works, things that haven't necessarily got a through line to profit. That then orientates business models, as you're seeing in the streamers, to sport, because built-in audiences, news, formats, reality TV. So this is not surprising. This is about opportunism in regulatory reform to change the risk profile reporting to boards in which you don't have to take risks. The good thing is we mitigate risk all the time by providing Screen Australia investment, by providing tax credits, by providing incentives to do that. And in fact, most commissioners from those broadcasters and streamers are secretly saying, Matt, help us get these regulations in place, because that way we've got money we can navigate domestically amongst global environments to be able to invest and continue to do the work we want to do.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and this is part of our opportunity now that Trump has given us, thank you, which is the whole elbows up business, right? Like we are Canadian. We commissioned a poll a little while ago that showed that more than 90% of Canadians are in favor of domestically owned, retained IP Canadian production. We wouldn't have seen numbers like that even 3 months ago. So this is the opportunity. The broadcasters are starting to brand themselves as Captain Canada. So there's real opportunity here to ride that wave.
Who's going to go Captain Australia? Come on, someone do that.
And our real focus is on making sure that independent production is protected as well. And that's part of the challenge with the regulatory, is that there's some noise that they might get rid of the independent programs of national interest, but that's our goal, is to protect
It's an
that
opportunity
piece
for
of
the
it.
ABC too.
Yes, I'll choose not to entirely represent
it's all
the
you.
ABC on this panel this morning, if that's all right. I'll step in at some point. Karen, for Ontario Creates, what do you see as working best for growing the local screen industry? What's working and what's not working? And not only as a service sector, but as a sort of a prime creator of original content itself.
I think it comes back to that ecosystem that I was talking about, and having both strong service and a strong domestic industry for us, and those...
Do you have the settings right for that at the moment?
Sorry?
Do you have the settings right for that?
We're working towards it. How's that? I think the ideal for us would be a 50-50 kind of model, and we're sitting probably closer to 60-40 at the moment. We need the domestic numbers to come up. I think, Val, somebody said earlier, we had a sort of a record year for domestic production when the strikes were happening in the US, but as that has started to recover, obviously, we're seeing a bit of a drop-off there. But what's working is the incentive system. So we, aside from the exceptional talent and the no surprises kind of environment that we offer, we really do have, both at the national level and at the state level, terrific tax incentives that are where the rates are higher and more generous if it is a domestic production or an international co-production. So it helps to incent that. And then on the investment side of the business, we're moving from very rigid sort of film fund, interactive fund structures to much more flexible, looser. We've just launched a new IP fund in Ontario, which is intended to say to producers, bring us your good content and let us figure out how to help you.
Right, yeah.
And so your business models can be more flexible, can be more nimble. We're not trying to force you into sort of rigid, our rigid bureaucratic structures anymore, but saying we can help you at the development stage, we can help you at the production stage, and we can help you at the marketing and distribution stage so that you can actually get to your audiences with that content. And I think that's a key piece of the equation.
I think we're doing that at the federal level too, but I think I want to pick up on what Karen said about incentives. You know, this thing with the streamers, maybe I'm naive or Pollyanna, I don't know. But, you know, this thing about penalizing and forcing, and you have to do this, and it has to be regulated, and, you got to force into this buttonhole. It doesn't really work sometimes when you're antagonistic towards potential partners. Now, I know what they're
Ask
like.
Mr. Trump.
Well, but you know what they're like. Okay, yeah, they argue they twist, turn, manipulate, they don't want to do it. But we've seen lots of examples through our fund with Canadian broadcasters and streamers that are highly successful. I just hope we can find a way to incentivize more. It's that old stick-carrot analogy, Can you incentivize through various ways so that they'll be good partners in the country or not? Like, it's hard to say, because some would argue even our Canadian broadcasting system are not the greatest partners sometimes,
I think what we're also struggling with, and this is the twisting turning, is that we're sort of exhausted from the policy battle of this rather than the practical, let's go on and do it. And I look to the French, who implemented this fast, quick, yes, it's significant, it's 25.5% of their overall. They have got, the policy people will never calm down, but the industry seems to have just gone on with it, and they are doing incredibly well, and I think the contribution is fantastic, and it's just moved on.
But that comes down to national culture, what you were talking about before about Canadian pride. I mean, that represents French thinking. It's always been French.
European.
French. French is best. Our farmers, the way our farmers grow, the way our cheese is made, and so I would expect something, as forceful as that. But it's always going to be different in different sectors, isn't it?
Well, and that's
Lisa?
the real challenge in Canada is we are, everyone looks to other jurisdictions and the rules that they've put in place, but Canada is a unicorn in the world in that we live next door to the biggest producer of content in the world, and we look and sound virtually the same. There are small nuances in the difference in our culture that are being exaggerated and being embraced now with the threats to our sovereignty, but we do look very much the same. So in order for Canadian producers to succeed in the international market, quite often they default to making shows that look like American shows so they can sell them overseas. So trying to find that balance and trying to create an audience in Canada is a real challenge.
Well, tell
I
us a
still
little bit
believe
more-
we think differently, though, and our values fundamentally are different. That's what Canada has risen up
And the
to.
humour.
Valerie, Valerie, say the word about.
About.
No, say it like a Canadian.
About. About. I don't
About.
what the
About.
fuck is Canadian about? I don't know.
What
We're
the
myth busting up here.
That's the key difference.
My point, though, is about the speed. If this had been a Band-Aid just to get on with it, we would have been, I think, in a much happier space. But our countries have dragged the chain on this for a long time, and that's a problem.
I just want to ask Lisa about what's being described as CanCon, Canadian content, and also the challenge around the definition of that. But just to remind you, if you've got questions, please put them on the app. And remember, you can vote up questions as well, ones that you quite like the look of that you'd really like me to ask. I've got a couple here I'm going to get to. But can you talk us through where that discussion is landing?
Sure. Well, this is where it gets a bit complicated because there are a few doors into Canadian content in Canada. What the CRTC is doing right now is looking at its definition of Canadian program. There's also the tax credit governs the definition of Canadian program, and in the reality, most productions require a Canadian content tax credit, so they go through that door. What the CRTC is looking at is expanding that definition a little bit to allow for streamer broadcast models and streamer business models, and to expand flexibility, introducing things like more creative content points for makeup and hair and costume design and showrunner and that kind of thing to try and embrace that flexibility. And the other thing they're looking at is more flexible ownership models. So the challenge is for us to make sure that number one priority is still full Canadian content, full Canadian production ownership. But the really difficult part is, and this gets very technical, is the CRTC doesn't have a tax credit attached, and it doesn't have an ownership requirement right now. So if it's redefining Canadian programming, we need to make sure that there's some protection there for Canadian ownership of that content.
Did you want to jump in there, Valerie?
Yeah, I think Lisa's absolutely right, and it is really complicated, but I think the CRTC is still the governing body on the regulatory piece directed by government. CAVCO is the tax credit body under finance, so there's sometimes a disconnect. But I think with this broader modernization process that seems to be picking up steam, and I heard Carney say one of his objectives is to combine duplication and resources. So I think everybody will have to get in line, whatever the decisions are, because you can't have two systems that do different things and have different definitions. And that's not going to be fast. I mean, it's taken this long from a policy perspective to get to where we are. It's probably another couple of years. God help us, I'll be 75.
But still swearing, I would imagine.
Yeah, still worse probably.
I've got a lovely question here about co-pros, which I'll get to, but I think this leads into it. Are then, given the realities and given just the heft and the might of the US market, are smaller English language nations like us, which have that advantage of having that language connection, are we doomed to become just service providers for Hollywood? Is there anything we can do to actually thwart that or to lift our position in the game, Matt?
Well, I certainly hope not.
We're all going to talk at once. I think we
No.
just find ways domestically to support, as Karen has mentioned, we've talked about all week, authentic, original storytelling that will resonate in the world and get behind that. And the North of North is a prime example of that, and there's many, many more. We don't want to lose the service production, I'm not saying that. But there's a risk of what you just said, and I think, we talk about, I think Michael talked yesterday about the Nordic countries, and everybody has this identity. We haven't really focused on that in Canada for all the points that people have made about the porous border, but I think it's time. Canadians want their identity to be strong. They've made that really clear. And as a sector, we better get on that like really fast because the wave is high now.
And the tools are regulatory, right? And the streamers they're in the system, and they are also sucking money away from the Canadian broadcasters in terms of subscriber revenue and ad revenue. So they're in the system. We need to find a way to.
I keep going back to that yin and yang piece. There's a couple of businesses that I won't name them, but they've gone from being very IP focused to then moving to service businesses in the absence of, say, children's content. Requirements more broadly. And what they're finding, though, is that the people that they really were, the talent they had, if they haven't got the steerage of their own projects, they're going to lose them and are losing them. And then that affects the service part of the industry. So, in other words, having people the capacity to drive their own projects creatively, tell their own stories, is actually critical to being able to successfully do the whole thing. So, in other words, you can't have one really without the other.
And I don't think we have seen huge increases in tax credit rates or anything like that that's sort of driving that race to the bottom. That's not what's happening. I think there is actually a moment in time right now, as we've been talking about, where the opposite could be true. What we might come out of this with is a stronger, more thriving domestic industry than we've ever had before. And as Matt says, having companies with the control of their own businesses and the ability to do both, service work and local work, is key to that.
Yeah, it's like any other industry. The control of intellectual property is the whole ballgame, right?
We'll get to a couple of questions. I've got a couple of minutes left. From Thomas Robbins, what's your appetite for three-way co-pros with Canada,
Hello.
Australia and New Zealand, asking for a Kiwi friend? Honestly, it's first thing in the morning, Matt. Do you see us playing a
I
part
didn't ask the question.
in this new world we are in?
Well, every kind of co-pro is important. There have been lots of different models, 2 countries, 3. I think Red Violin had 13 production companies in it, and I think 9 or 10 countries. So Canada's open. I don't think we have restrictions on how many countries can come to the table. Often it's a question of mostly financing, but if the story drives it, why not?
Well, it's more a question, isn't it, about the scale that can be achieved by English-speaking smaller
Exactly.
nations
It
banding
adds-
together.
It adds complexity, but and I'm looking at our wonderful colleagues at Sparta who are talking. But they are the Kiwis are great, colleagues, and they are great partners. So the idea that you bring good people together, we were talking about it in the CoPro Day. It is about creating marriages and that are going to last the period of probably whatever 7 years, sometimes the gestation of these things. So in other words, the partnership and the mindset of the people and their willingness to kind of go through the trials and tribulations of getting anything made is the critical piece. And I think the Kiwis, Australians, Canadians are just on the same ballpark with all of this stuff.
Canada is one of the most diverse countries in the world. We have in excess of 200 languages, people from all over the world. And if we're going to make content that's actually targeted at those audiences, that's representative and inclusive of all of those people, we need to have international partnerships in terms of telling those stories. We've got nearly 60 co-production treaties in Canada. Not all of them, as Val would say, are in
6 are
active
used
use.
mostly.
Okay, that's an
Australia's
exaggeration.
too.
But
10 maybe.
But it opens, it creates all kinds of opportunities for one-on-one partnerships and for multi-partite partnerships. And it also makes Canada a nice partner for other countries who don't necessarily have treaties with one another. So I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, and that's why we've got our Canadian delegation here.
The treaties are great, and they're the best way and the most amount of money, but there are other ways that people can work together, and we've talked about this in the sessions over the last couple of days. There are lots of co-ventures that happen. We at the CMF developed partnerships. The first one was with New Zealand On Air on digital media. It was the first in the world, agency to agency, because you can be a lot more flexible. So we're talking about those things again. We had one with Australia for a while. So there's lots of ways to get that activity stimulated, I think, other than official treaty co-pro.
The treaty starts the conversation,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily where the partnership ends, and that's totally fine.
Just a final question from the room, from Marcus Gilzer, I think it's pronounced, Gilzer. Can we leverage streamers' tax avoidance in negotiations? Netflix revenue, 1.2 billion, profit, 26% tax paid, 22 million, which is less than what was secured through tax incentives. Any chance of this, Matt?
I mean,
We need the finance minister.
No.
here for that one.
Well, yeah. I think there's different efforts that have been done over the years to try to create global tax regimes. I don't know whether we've got a global framework possible at the moment, given where we are with Trump, in a nutshell, and the US behaviour. So I think we're on a trajectory to try to get that, and it would have, and I think various places that have renowned for being more of a haven. You know, there's a reason why Amazon's in Ireland. There's a reason why actually Netflix is founded and based in the Netherlands. You know, rather than so you sort of think of these as American businesses. By the way, they're actually, I don't know where, you know, their headquarters are not in America, but on many levels. But
It's on some coral atoll, I think.
yeah, but I don't think that's the problem is that global businesses, that's another bigger exercise in world cooperation, which doesn't feel like we're in the right trajectory for right at this point.
And it's way beyond our remit as well, although it's something we would all fervently hope for. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for being here. Please thank your terrific panel, Valerie Creighton, Karen Thornstone, Lisa Broadfoot and Matt Dina.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you very much.
Whoa. Woohoo. Enjoy the rest of your sessions. What have we got next, Matt? You know the program. What's
I have
happening?
no idea. Hopefully someone else will tell me. But
Have a look
Virginia's
at your
on this
program.
afternoon as well, so, you know, she's not going anywhere, are you?